we talk about church planting, we need to ask ourselves, what is it we want to plant? Here's the list they came up with. A group of believers, someone had that are formally recognised as a church. Yeah, there's a bit of, that's necessary these days because, you know, with all the legal requirements and liabilities and so forth, a church needs to be aligned. It gives accountability in a spiritual sense. So we're accountable to others, but also we're seen to be doing the right thing by the community. And so, you know, churches need a constitution. You need that, you know, if you're going to operate a bank account, things like that. You need to safeguard. The church needs to safeguard itself because you've got people there working with children and so on. So a little explanation on that second one I think is necessary. It needs to be formally recognised as a church. They've recognised elders and leaders. And here we've had this one many times. They worship, meet together, care for one another, evangelise and make disciples. And they have an agreed doctrinal base that enables them to work together in unity. So if you've got 3 or more of those things on your list, just put your hand up. Oh, wonderful. Hey, I can go home. You guys know what a local church is all about. All right. The question is, how do we plant one? Somebody said, and this has been bandied around so much that I think the author has been forgotten, but the fruit, we'll put this up on the screen, the fruit of an apple tree is not an apple, but another apple tree. You know, when we start to think about churches, we think about living organisms, not static organisations. And when we think about something living, we need to see what we're doing as producing other churches, and we'll find out why as we go on. So if we're just going to produce disciples and it ends there, or new converts and it ends there, we've only got half the story. If we're going to disciple nations, which is the Great Commission, well then we need, I believe, churches are the best way to do that. So we disciple nations, we evangelize, we disciple the new converts, we gather them into groups, churches, and the churches do the work of the kingdom because the kingdom of God is powerful. You know, I looked at a number of verses, and I'll just put this one verse up, which really sums up all the others that I read. You know, this is Jesus is saying it, Paul's saying it, Peter's saying it. The kingdom of God is not a matter of talk, but of power. And the kingdom of God being manifest, being spread through a local church where the kingdom of God is demonstrated, you know, going with the message, the good news, healing the sick, raising the dead, casting out demons. All of that is the work of the kingdom. And as the world sees the church doing that, we're going to see individuals and then nations discipled. Wales is a classic example. Great revival there in 1904. And if you've ever been to a rugby match or watched a rugby match in Cardiff, there's something stirring about that place. The Lord's still stirring in that place. You know, they stand up and sing with a passion, "Guide me, O thou great Jehovah, pilgrim through this barren land." Check out some of the rugby songs on YouTube and have a look at the a Welsh rugby match, and they're still singing a song that they learned back in the revival. It's not transforming the nation as such, but you know, it's a picture of what's happened over 100 years, where the revival has just slowly waned, but it's the church coming alive that made a difference to that nation. and then out of that, other nations around the world. Local churches reach communities, they reach areas, they reach cities. And it was Peter Wagner that said, and we'll put his, planting new churches is the most effective means of evangelism. So we've looked at a little of the background to church planting. Now we're going to get into what I call the nitty-gritty. How do we actually plant churches? So let's have a look at number 3, some church planting models. You know, for centuries, the church has changed very little in terms of its structure. The world has seen the church in a particular light, often church buildings and certain forms of worship that have been fairly familiar. There's been the liturgical churches, like Catholic, Anglican churches, but then there's churches that have come out of revival, but you look at them, churches that have come out of revival, there's a certain format. You know, very often there'll be a time of worship, there'll be the preaching of the word, and there'll be prayer interspersed and Bible reading interspersed in the midst of that. Pretty much a set form. So what's happened is, from about the 4th century, this maintenance model, I call it, has existed. It was Constantine, the Emperor Constantine, who some say he became a Christian, some say he just converted to a religious form of Christianity. Only the Lord knows where he really stood. But what he did was he legalized Christianity, made it the state religion, and then started to give to the church power in the communities where the churches have been planted and were forming. And they developed this maintenance model that extended into the governments of the day. But beyond that, in this maintenance model, the churches existed, particularly in the Western world, in a friendly environment, because the churches had a big influence. Many of our laws have been based on the 10 Commandments. And the church has been involved in Parliament, making laws, the judiciary, in teaching. Sunday schools initially were set up to teach people to read and write. Trade unions came out of the church, wanting to help workers that were having to work incredibly long hours. Hospitals, all of these things came out of the church. And so the church has existed in a friendly environment and had a big influence on Western society. And then it spread through the Western world as Western nations established colonies. So, you know, the Brits came out here to Australia, and of course, with the First Fleet came an evangelical Anglican. And he was actually one of the disciples of John Newton, who wrote Amazing Grace. And so we have churches established in Australia, and again, they're established, they're planted on this fairly predictable maintenance model. But now we find ourselves coming, as now well into the 21st century, this maintenance model of church is marginalised and pushed to the edges. So now what we are seeing is an emerging model. If we go to the next one, the mission model. It's still emerging, but it's built on the model of the New Testament church. And that's why we wanted to start tonight in the book of Acts, because if you read the book of Acts, it really tells us how to plant churches today. Read it carefully. Paul says, I was shipwrecked, I was stoned, I was beaten, I was in prison. Read the book of Acts and you see how churches are planted.